Hey everyone, Laszlo Montgomery here, back again with a CHP special episode. Last time I had Jeremiah Jenne on the program, the feedback I got indicated a high degree of customer satisfaction. So I thought, well, it worked for The Godfather and The French Connection. Why wouldn't it work in this case? So Jeremiah's back with the sequel. You all know him as the one who's not David Moser of the Barbarians at the Gate podcast and from Beijing by Foot. And it gives me lots of great pleasure to welcome back to the CHP one of the truly great permanent fixtures of the Beijing expat scene, Dr. Jeremiah Jenne. Welcome back, sir.
Well, thank you, Laszlo. Hopefully this is Godfather 2 and not Godfather 3, which we can all safely say never really existed.
Last time you were on the CHP, we discussed the Forbidden City. And this time we're going to zoom way out and look at the history of Beijing. And I was thinking, since I got you here, let's go back as far as we possibly can with the history of Beijing before the city even existed. So, Shang Dynasty, Zhou, when did things begin in this part of China that became the future site of the city of Beijing?
Well, it's interesting because there's been a city in this spot, roughly where I am right now, going back nearly 3,000 years. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the city of Beijing that we would visit in the 21st century is 3,000 years old. What that means is, going back to some of the earliest civilizations in China and some of the earliest dynasties in China, you had cities that were here, urban spaces of varying sizes that were very important regionally. They were the capital of regional states. Like during the Warring States period, you have the capital of Yan, capital of G, you have other states that were here. And, this was a convenient location as a capital, or this particular area was a convenient location for a capital of those earlier states. But really, for the first 2,000 or so years of the 3,000-year history of urban spaces in this location, a lot of what these cities were either regional capitals or convenient locations for gathering trade goods or your military before heading out beyond the frontier, beyond the borders of historical China. And a lot of that has to do with the geography of where Beijing is today, and of course the geography of what we kind of think of as historical China.
So what changed around the 12th, 13th century? Why did the Beijing area start to become more than just a capital of some warring state?
Well, even after the Warring States period, there were cities here. They really kind of benefited from its location, which meant that if you were, the mountains that are just north of Beijing, they're where you go if you want to visit the Great Wall as it exists today. This was the frontier. There wasn't necessarily a sign outside the walls of Beijing that said this is your last chance for civilization as far as you can walk, but essentially it was. So if you were a trade caravan heading out to the great unknown, what would later be called the Silk Roads, this is where you got everything together before you headed out those mountain passes and then went to the left. Or if you're, say, an emperor of the Sui or Tang dynasty and your, hobby is invading Korea, it's where you get a lot of your military together before you head out those mountain passes and hang a right and go see what the Koreans are up to. But what changes that, right, in the 10th, 11th, 12th century is when people from outside this frontier, on the other side of the frontier, start coming in. And so, of course, in the 10th century, we have a group called the Khitan. They originate in the steppes of what's today Mongolia. And they come in and they conquer just a little tiny sliver of northern China, just about 16 counties, including the area around modern-day Beijing. And they are so psyched because for them, this isn't the last stop out of civilization. This is the foot in the door of civilization. And so the Liao, who had 5 capitals for reasons, decide to establish one of their capitals in this spot. And they call it, helpfully enough, the southern capital, which is kind of confusing because, of course, Beijing, as it becomes known later, means northern capital. But for the Liao, they're like, okay, we've got our little capital right here. And this is really the first time that the area around Beijing becomes the capital of something you might think of as like an empire. Well, here's the thing. If you ever decide, in your post-podcast career that what you really want to do is establish a sort of Central or North Asian nomadic empire with aspirations to conquer China, what you will want to do, of course, is not just conquer a little bit of China, but you always have to keep an eye on your sixth. You always have to look behind you because there's always the bigger, badder nomad. And in the case of the Liao, the Khitan and their Liao Empire, behind them, coming up from the forests of Manchuria, was another group called the Jushen or Jurchen, who had their Jin Empire. Well, following a play from the old playbook, they sweep in, they conquer the Liao Empire. That little they don't just stop at 16 counties though. They keep going until they take almost the northern half of China from the Song dynasty, and then they establish the Jin Empire establishes their capital right on the ruins of the old Liao capital. But since this isn't like kind of in the southern part of their empire, if you look at a map, it's kind of in the middle. They call it the Middle Capital. Mm-hmm. And of course, after that, as we'll talk about in a moment, in the 13th century, another empire coming in from North or Central Asia, a group that's perhaps more familiar to listeners around the world. Of course, the Mongolian Empire, Genghis Khan, his descendants. And of course, they come in conquering the Jurchen, the Jin Empire, the Song dynasty, everything really between Korea and Kiev. And it's Kublai Khan in the late 13th century who moves his capital to where we are right now, establishing the city of Khanbaliq, or as we call it in Chinese, Dadu.
All right, so Beijing went from being the middle capital. What was that?
Middle capital, and it was great capital or city of the Khan. So we're not only are we doing a lot of urban redesign, we're doing a lot of rebranding too.
Oh yeah, by the way, has there been any updates on the Yuan Dynasty palace that's underneath the current footprint of the Forbidden City?
Nothing to update on that. I think that was pretty substantial. That was interesting because I think it's all, as we talked about in our earlier podcast, there's always been a sense and a pretty good idea that the Mongolian palace was there. And we take a look at a map of, Kublai Khan city, which was, incredible exercise in urban planning that involved Chinese architects and engineers from all over, his empire. And, it maps very, very neatly with a lot of what is Beijing today. Kublai Khan probably wouldn't recognize much of the buildings or really a lot of things kind of on the streets, but there are definitely roads, streets, areas of the city that he would be at least relatively familiar with from the capital that he had built in the late 13th century.
All right, we already covered Zhu Di, the Prince of Yen, and his choice of Beijing as the site of his new capital and the building of the Forbidden City. Can you run us through the more noteworthy history hits from the Ming? When you're walking around Beijing today, are there any ghosts of the Ming Dynasty speaking to you?
Sure, absolutely. All kinds of ghosts. It also is very dependent upon how much baijiu you drink, and then the ghosts come out even more so. The Ming, we talked about this, but Zhu Di, the Yongle Emperor, is responsible as much, if not more, than any other ruler for the way Beijing looks in its configuration down to the 20th century. So Kublai, as we talked about, had his capital and left many important contributions on the city. We mentioned some of the roads, the waterways of Beijing, the system of canals that today still flows through the city, creating the lakes that we see, the imperial moat, the old city moat that still flows in sections around the wall. All of that is the result of engineers and hydraulic planners that worked for Kublai Khan. But the Ming Dynasty, and then under the Ming Dynasty, not only does the Yongle Emperor build the Forbidden City, but he also kind of reconfigures the city somewhat. And what I mean by that is that the city of the Khans was actually a lot longer south to north than the Ming Dynasty city. They brought in the northern wall quite a considerable distance, creating more of a square rather than a rectangle. And that particular configuration where those walls were built under the Yongle Emperor and then improved later on, those walls stood in more or less the same spot with those gates into the 1950s. That's a pretty remarkable track record. And these walls, as they stood into the 20th century, man, this was Beijing's landmark. You look back at sources, either from Chinese travelers, from foreign travelers, and everyone who came to Beijing, they all talked about the walls. Part of it was if you were traveling even by canal or by foot or by cart, the walls were what you saw first because they would be towering, looming in the distance. They were so massive. And so as people approached the capital, they'd come under the shadow of these enormous walls passing through gigantic gates with towers, and these gates were double gated. So there was a gate in front, like an arrow tower, and then there was a second gate in the back, and there was a space in between where, if you happen to be trying to get into the city for nefarious purposes, you'd be kind of trapped between these two gates in a giant bowl of hot death. But these gates also serve to kind of control and check everyone who came in the city. So you can imagine approaching this grand capital and how that would completely blow your mind if you've been traveling to smaller cities, or if you've been traveling from outside an empire that did not do walls like the Ming Dynasty did, what the effect that would be on your first impressions of the city.
Any city landmarks you occasionally pass that date to the Ming?
That's a little tough because there are certainly landmarks in the city that were here during the Ming Dynasty. Absolutely. There's even some sections of the city wall that were built under the Ming Dynasty that still exist to this day. As many people know, most of the walls of Beijing and the gates of Beijing came down in the 20th century. There are still some sections that you can see, though, and they give at least a little bit of an idea of what these structures look like. And of course, many of the sites of Beijing, we think of like the Temple of Heaven. We think about, of course, the Forbidden City. There are other sites in Beijing that date from the Ming Dynasty. We have some sites like the Confucian Temple that even date from the Yuan Dynasty, the time of the Mongolians. The challenge, of course, is that a lot of these sites, in China, as you know, the site tends to matter more than the actual structure. So the site is eternal, but the buildings are decoration. The buildings are kind of on top of the site, and the buildings can be changed. So it's a little bit different from when we say go to Rome and we walk around and we touch the church where that stone and that brick has been there, since the 4th century AD or the 5th century AD. In Beijing, by and large, you're standing in a place that has been used for a single purpose or for the same purpose going back to the Ming Dynasty. But the building you're touching, the walls you're touching, with a few exceptions, are by and large a product of a later age. In this case, mostly from the second dynasty, the dynasty after the Ming, to use Beijing as their capital, the Qing Dynasty.
Well, maybe because it was the most recent, that's why we remember it most, but let's do the same thing with the Qing. Where are all the city improvements that occurred during the Qing that are hiding in plain sight?
Everywhere. I mean, a lot of this has to do, when the Qing Empire moves their capital to Beijing and the Manchus take up residence in Beijing, there's a lot of changes, not to the city, not the least of which, of course, is a change in kind of the demographics of the city. So Beijing, by the time we reach the period of the Qing moving their capital there in 1644, there's kind of two separate cities. There's the northern city, the kind of square city built by the Yongle Emperor. There's a kind of southern city, a little bit more like a rectangle, just that abuts to the northern city, just to the south. That city kind of incorporates what used to be the southern suburbs, but also the Temple of Heaven. In the Qing Dynasty, the northern part of the city area around the Forbidden City, becomes primarily the reserve of the Manchu banners. The Manchus organized their society under these different colored flags, both for military and for social purposes. And the different neighborhoods around the Forbidden City became the homes to these different banners. And primarily, of course, these banners were made up of Manchus, but also some Chinese, Mongolians, and others would join the banners. But it was a much more controlled, regulated environment in the northern city. And of course, in the southern city is where a lot of the Chinese residents moved, or to be politically correct, the residents moved. And of course, they took all the fun with them. So most of the big markets and the stores and the restaurants and the brothels and the theaters, and that kind of crops up in the southern city. And so one of the things that the Manchus do, and this persists to the 20th century, is there's a different feeling in this northern part of the city, around the Forbidden City, around the palace, than there is in the southern part of the city. In the north, it's regulated hutons, east, west, north, south, like a grid. In the southern part of the city, as my good friend Lars from Beijing Postcards done a lot of research on this, you got all these kind of commercial alleyways that kind of move around in somewhat more of an organic pattern. And so that's one of the biggest changes. The Manchus also add some things to the skyline. In Beihai Park, which is a park right next to the Forbidden City, just north of the regime's compound in Zhongnanhai, they put a white stupa that was put up in 1652 on the occasion of a visit from the Dalai Lama, And of course, a Tibetan style stupa in the middle of the city, towering above many of the other structures. You can imagine some of the Chinese residents of Beijing going, huh, that's a choice. And there were some early changes. And of course, later on, as we'll talk about, the Qianlong Emperor who ruled in the 18th century, perhaps as much as Kublai Khan and Zhu Di left his mark on this city.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. Who was the greatest builder in Beijing? Who added the most improvements?
Spruced up everything, Laszlo. I mean, you walk around Beijing and the number of signs that you see that say, like, built in 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, but completely remodeled by the Qianlong Emperor in the 18th century is a very long list. It's his grandfather, the Kangxi Emperor, that begins the building of the imperial residence known as the Summer Palace, but Qianlong completely expands them, creating this massive amusement park for himself, with all kinds of different buildings from all over the world, even, of course, famously, a set of Western palaces designed by an Italian Jesuit, Giuseppe Castiglione. And then, the Forbidden City was remodeled. The Temple of Heaven was remodeled. He's also the person who, along with his mother, helped to consecrate the space known as the Lama Temple. When we walk around Beijing today and we go do the tourist stuff in Beijing today, yes, we are looking at old sites and impressive history. But a lot of what we're looking at in terms of like the design vision, is very much a product of the Qianlong Emperor, and certainly a product of the Qianlong Emperor's rather liberal use of the imperial treasury.
Yeah, if the profligate Qianlong Emperor had invested some of that wealth instead of blowing it all on city improvements, even with an 8% return come the Qingchao Monyan, they wouldn't have had to take on all those foreign loans.
If I just bought Apple stock in 1990 instead of an Apple G4, I'd probably be a lot better off.
How did the city grow population and area-wise from the time of the Ming to the Qing?
Historical demography, as you know, is always a little bit of a tricky game because, we have tax records, we have population registers, but, sometimes a little hard to get exact numbers. By most counts, the city of Beijing fluctuated between about 1 million and 2 million people during the Ming and the Qing period. And that incorporates not just inside the city, but in these kind of clusters that exist just outside the gates all around the city. I think, the biggest change perhaps for the city was the shift in population or the change in the neighborhoods themselves. And that was certainly something that affected as I said, the whole, not only the development of the city in the time, but even, the way the city looks today. I think part of that too, part of the effects of that were an initial depopulation of Beijing and China during the Ming-Qing transition for all kinds of reasons. Not the least was war, famine, plague, and other things. There was a plague going on in China even before the Manchus came in. And of course, the Manchus themselves, when they came in, were introduced to fascinating new microbes like smallpox. So it took a while for things to rebound, but it rebounded, as we know, very quickly. The population of the Qing Empire, by some counts, more than doubles between 1644 and 1800, towards the end of the Qianlong Emperor's reign. A lot of that has to do with the expansion of the empire, but also the opening of arable land that allowed growing of new crops that were coming from other parts of the world, like corn, soy, sweet potatoes, ground nuts, things like that. And that had a big effect around Beijing. Because if you look around the city, even today, if you go into the areas in the hills and the rural areas, the rural parts of the Beijing municipality, and you take a look at what people are growing, they're crops from the Columbian, they still are crops from the Columbian Exchange. Corn, sweet potatoes are still some of the biggest crops in the rural areas of Beijing and immediately adjacent in the province of Hebei. And a large part of that has to do with, the area around Beijing being historically pretty dry. And not always suitable for things like growing of wheat or, of course, or rice. Beijing is a weird city in some ways because it's one of the few ancient, in some ways, not quite a few ways, but what I'm going to talk about now.
Expats there, man.
Yes, you have to be a little off just to kind of, why are you? I lived here for 20 years. Why? But the one that I always think of is that you think about all the really major cities of the world, especially capitals, especially cities with like a long history of continuous urban use. And you all usually find some kind of like major body of water. Like you find like there's a river, there's a lake, there's a coastline of some kind. Beijing doesn't really have any significant bodies, natural bodies of water.
That moat around the Forbidden City wasn't natural?
Yeah, those are artificial though.
Oh,
there's no river coming through.
Natural?
Yeah. not that we know of. And so the thing is, like, Beijing has we often in the 21st century have talked about, or the 20th century and 21st century have talked about Beijing's challenges with like air pollution, some of the environmental factors limiting the city's growth. But I'll tell you, for most of the city's history, one of the greatest limitations on the city, not just on the agriculture around it, but also on the city itself, has been, of course, the supply of water. The city sits, so far as we know, it sits on a large aquifer. So a lot of the water that's provided for the city, historically has come from wells that have gone down to the aquifer. But the aquifer is leftover water from when the Bohai Sea, the Gulf, receded many thousands of years ago. And it's always been a little bit like brackish and not particular. Yeah. And that's one reason why people, in the imperial period would get their water trucked in these giant kegs from the springs up in the Western Hills. But the larger point of that is that, where are you going to get the water? And as Beijing has gone from a city of 1 or 2 million people in the imperial period to a city of 9 million, 13 million, 20 million city people in the 20th and 21st century, and those issues have become even more pressing.
Control of Beijing changed hands more than a few times since the fall of the Qing in 1912. What historical events might a Beijinger of that day and age have possibly witnessed with their own eyes? May 4th, for one.
Sure. I think if you were living in Beijing in the 19th and early 20th century, you like any other city in China, you saw some pretty momentous changes, not the least of which, of course, was the coming of the foreign powers. And, it affected Beijing later than it affected some of the coastal cities like Guangzhou or Tianjin, or, of course, the development of the city of Shanghai. But, Beijing certainly took its share of blows during the 19th century. I mean, it was occupied in 1860 during the Anglo-French expedition that led to the burning of the Yuan, the Old Summer Palace. And of course, it was occupied again during the Boxer War after the 8-country Allied Army Expeditionary Force invades in 1900. So if you're living in Beijing, you're seeing a city that is changing, maybe not as fast as a place like Shanghai, maybe not as fast as a place like Guangzhou, never mind a full colony like Hong Kong. But you're starting to see an increasing amount of influence from the rest of the world. Slowly, for sure, but inexorably. And of course, after the dynasty ends, the Qing dynasty abdicates in February 1912. After the abdication, of course, the city changes much quicker and more dramatically. The city, in some ways, is thrown open to influences that were always kind of kept out a little bit by the presence of the imperial court. And, cityscape starts to change accordingly. All these, banner people, the people of the banners, the officials that serve the Qing dynasty, they've lost their jobs. You have hundreds, if not thousands, of imperial eunuchs that aren't necessarily needed anymore now that there's just, a child ex-emperor in the Forbidden City that doesn't need, a huge staff. You have different forms of social control, new ideas of policing, new ideas of organizing commerce, new ideas of organizing guilds. And of course, with the end of the examination system, which used to be a big deal in Beijing, every 3 years, all the bright young minds of China would show up to take this exam and also generally party in the brothels. That was a bit of a thing. But also, once the end of that exam system happens, some of these same bright young minds are showing up in Beijing again, but now they're going to universities. They're coming to study things here rather than simply just take the exam and then become an official. So there's a lot of things going on, socially, politically, and in terms of just how the city feels, the smells, the noise, the bustle, where things are being built, what things are being taken down, and what things are staying the same.
All right, in the time remaining, let's do a quick 走马看花 look at Beijing history since 1949. And why did they tear down those walls?
Well, this is one of those things where, yes, it's very easy to lament the demise of the city walls, and it is a big deal. I mean, there were some after 1949, after the Communist Party takes over and they decide to establish their capital at Beijing. There's a lot of plans for the city, and there's some competing visions for what the city should look like. One of those famous plans, by several architects, including Liang Sicheng and urban planners, thought, well, let's kind of keep the old city as it is, and we'll build like a new administrative capital just next to it, kind of an old city and new city, which ironically is how many cities in China today kind of look. You have like that old town, and then you have the new city built around it. But for various reasons, ideological, practical, political, the leadership wanted to be in the city, and once they were in the city, they had an idea for what a socialist capital should look like. They had some inspiration and some advice from Soviet advisors who definitely had an idea what a socialist capital should look like. And not all of these suggestions were conducive to the preservation of imperial spaces. Ideologically, there was not necessarily a lot of motivation to preserve imperial spaces or old culture. And of course, the incentive to industrialize, the incentive to modernize, the incentive to create a city that could be a showcase for this dynamic new people's republic was huge. And the result was neighborhoods being torn down, streets widened, walls coming down, gates coming down, subways being built, whole new plazas being built like Tiananmen Square, new buildings of state, emerging just south of the Forbidden City. The city became a hybrid city with like this new socialist capital with its like grandeur on top of and adjacent to, sometimes awkwardly, the remnants of the imperial past. And even today, where you have a third layer, right? The layer of kind of modern economic development, the malls, the malls, the stores, the hotels. Even though the city has in recent years, to their credit, tried to really limit this kind of development in the historic center, you kind of have like this imperial city on top the socialist capital, on top China a go-go. And, these things exist once again. And I should point out too, we sometimes read like guidebooks and they're like, Beijing, where modernity and tradition lie in uneasy juxtaposition. I mean, nobody ever says that about Boston, where it's equally true. So I don't want to make this sound like Beijing is some sort of unique case or some sort of unicorn here. A lot of cities exist with different layers. But of course, if you come to Beijing, you see those layers very, very clearly as you're walking around the city, particularly, in the city center.
All right, last thing before we go. How about for you personally? You got there in 2002, and it's now about 21 years. How has Beijing transformed just within the span of those 7,600 days of your life that you called that place home?
It makes me recall a common expression among the expatriate community here, which is Beijing, where the days seem to last forever, but the years go by in seconds. So it has been a while, and I think on some level I have seen a lot of changes, although I'm always interested in talking to people who are here and then left and they came back, because I think sometimes they see it more than I do, because it kind of comes up around me. But I think the biggest change, and the one I'll focus on here, has been the city's approach to what we think of as historic preservation. That it had, in the last 20 years, the city has moved from sort of wholesale demolition of neighborhoods and the building of whatever to a plan, at least, that is trying to create a historic city center that will have mixed use, retail, residential. And, the ultimate goal, I suspect, is the creation of some kind of commercially viable but historically cute old town, like we see in many other Chinese cities, or for that matter, we see in many cities around the world. There are a lot of European cities, even some old American, like Boston, for example. Look at Faneuil Hall, Quincy Market, the conversion of like historical spaces into retail, high-end retail districts. This, I think, is the eventual goal for much of Beijing, at least the historic city center. But on the other hand, a lot of it isn't being taken down and torn down in quite the same way. And, there's new rules about what the height of buildings that can be built in the city center, the type of buildings that can be built in the city center. We can quibble about the plan and, the details of it, but there has been a commitment to some kind of historic preservation, recreation, look, feel for the city. That has been something that has really evolved in the last 20 years and been accelerated in the last 5 or 6 years. I'm always going to have a soft spot for the Beijing of the 2000s. As David Moser and I have joked on our own podcast, it is scary how many times we yearn for the golden days of freedom and openness that was the Hu Jintao years. But in fact, that was the case. Beijing is a much easier city to live in today. The water is clean, the air is cleaner. There are bike lanes. There's new infrastructure everywhere that makes it a very livable city. The rise of the delivery economy has the ride-hailing services have removed a lot of the challenges of getting around the city and getting supplies and getting fed and all that stuff that used to be the case back in like 2003, 2004. There's a lot of reasons that Beijing is a much more livable place than it was then. On the other hand, it's not a good time if you enjoy things like, non-governmental cultural spaces, or if you like your history with a little nuance and a little bit less teleology. So there's a lot of things going on right now that maybe aren't as visible as all the great new infrastructure that are more disconcerting to me as a historian. However, it is much easier for me to order my dumplings.
Well, I'm sure everyone who lasted this far will walk away feeling they got their money's worth. This was one informative discussion. I bet we'll be seeing this episode flying up the charts with a bullet. Thanks for coming on. I'll have to think of another topic to tempt you into another CHP appearance. I'm still paying off that invoice from the Forbidden City episode.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay, stay well. Dr. Jeremiah Jenne, ladies and gentlemen. All right, that's it for this time. Until we meet again, this here's Laszlo Montgomery signing off from the U.S. West Coast. Do consider coming back next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.